This week, we are going to discuss two different decades, the 1960s and the 1970s. So it's split into two separate PowerPoints. So for part one, we are just going to discuss the 1960s. So the first thing we'll look at is the election of 1960. In the election of 1960, we had Democratic candidate JFK versus Republican candidate Richard Nixon. During this election cycle, Alaska and Hawaii would become states, and JFK would win the presidency, but we would see vice presidential succession when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and he was replaced by his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. The major issue of the day was the space race and trying to keep up with the USSR technologically. Okay, so here is an example of, or a picture of the first televised presidential debate between JFK and Richard Nixon. So with this televised presidential debate, people who watched the debate on TV believed that Kennedy would win the election because he was very charismatic and he was charming and he was good looking. And Richard Nixon had a hard time being televised during the debate. He was really nervous and he would stutter a lot. But if people listened to the debate over the radio or just debates in general between these two, they assumed that Richard Nixon would win because he seemed like he knew what he was talking about. So television, the fact that this debate was televised definitely helped out Kennedy a little bit in winning the election. Okay, so shortly after Kennedy becomes president, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is also known as the October Crisis of 1962, the Caribbean Crisis, and also the Missile Scare. This was a 1-month, 4-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union.
It's not hard to imagine a world where at any given moment, you and everyone you know could be wiped out without warning at the push of a button. This was the reality for millions of people during the 45-year period after World War II, now known as the Cold War. As the United States and Soviet Union faced off across the globe, each knew that the other had nuclear weapons capable of destroying it. And destruction never loomed closer than during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the U.S. unsuccessfully tried to overthrow Cuba's new communist government. That failed attempt was known as the Bay of Pigs, and it convinced Cuba to seek help from the USSR. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was happy to comply by secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, not only to protect the island, but to counteract the threat from U.S. missiles in Italy and Turkey. By the time U.S. intelligence discovered the plan, the materials to create the missiles were already in place. At an emergency meeting on October 16, 1962, military advisors urged an airstrike on missile sites and invasion of the island. But President John F. Kennedy chose a more careful approach. On October 22nd, he announced that the U.S. Navy would intercept all shipments to Cuba. There was just one problem. A naval blockade was considered an act of war. Although the president called it a quarantine that did not block basic necessities, the Soviets didn't appreciate the distinction. In an outraged letter to Kennedy, Khrushchev wrote, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear missile war." Thus ensued the most intense 6 days of the Cold War. While the U.S. demanded the removal of the missiles, Cuba and the USSR insisted they were only defensive. And as the weapons continued to be armed, the U.S. prepared for a possible invasion. On October 27th, a spy plane piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down by a Soviet missile. The same day, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine was hit by a small depth charge from a U.S. Navy vessel trying to signal it to come up. The commanders on the sub, too deep to communicate with the surface, thought war had begun and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. That decision had to be made unanimously by 3 officers. The captain and political officer both authorized the launch, but Vasily Arkhipov, second in command, refused. His decision saved the day, and perhaps the world. But the crisis wasn't over. For the first time in history, the U.S. military set itself to DEFCON 2, the defense readiness one step away from nuclear war. With hundreds of nuclear missiles ready to launch, the metaphorical doomsday clock stood at 1 minute to midnight. But diplomacy carried on. In Washington, D.C., Attorney General Robert Kennedy secretly met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. After intense negotiation, they reached the following proposal. The U.S. would remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy and promise to never invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba under UN inspection. Once the meeting had concluded, Dobrynin cabled Moscow, saying time is of the essence and we shouldn't miss the chance. And at 9 a.m. the next day, a message arrived from Khrushchev announcing the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. The crisis was now over. While criticized at the time by their respective governments for bargaining with the enemy, contemporary historical analysis shows great admiration for Kennedy and Khrushchev's ability to diplomatically solve the crisis. But the disturbing lesson was that a slight communication error or split-second decision by a commander could have thwarted all their efforts, as it nearly did, if not for Vasily Arkhipov's courageous choice. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed just how fragile human politics are compared to the terrifying power they can unleash.
Okay, so now we are going to look at the civil rights movement during the 1960s. So here we have Coretta Scott King. She was married to Martin Luther King Jr., and she said that struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. Okay, so we have the continuation of the civil rights movement with the Greensboro sit-ins. So here are 2 pictures from the sit-ins, and the sit-ins were nonviolent protests in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they lasted from February 1st, 1960 to July 25th, 1960. The protests led to the Woolworth department store chain ending its policy of racial segregation in its stores in the southern United States. Okay, next we have freedom rides. So freedom rides were put together by freedom riders, and they were civil rights activists who rode interstate buses into the segregated southern United States in 1961, and in the years after that to challenge the non-enforcement of the United States Supreme Court decision Morgan versus Virginia, which ruled that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. So there was a Supreme Court case that said that if buses were going from one state to another, that it was illegal to segregate them, but that was still happening. So we had these civil rights activists who are riding these buses in protest of them being segregated. Move this. Okay. So the Albany movement. In the Albany movement, this is not talking about in New York. We're still in the South. So this was a small town in Southwest Georgia. They were known for their entrenched segregation and racial violence, and it seemed like an unlikely place for Black Americans to rally and demand change. So the Albany movement was a coalition. So we had a bunch of different civil rights organizers and organizations working together. And there were members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SCLC, and the NAACP. So this movement was halted by an Albany police chief, Pritchett, who began launching mass arrests, but he refused to engage in police brutality and bailed out leading officials to avoid negative media attention. Okay, so here are pictures of James Meredith. James Meredith is really important because in the civil rights movement, because he is the first African American student admitted to the racially segregated University of Mississippi. He was also an American civil rights movement figure, writer, political advisor, and he was an Air Force veteran. So in October 1962, James Meredith became the first African American student to enroll at the University of Mississippi. So his enrollment sparked a lot of riots on campus, which prompted JFK to send in U.S. Marshals and National Guardsmen to maintain order. So that's what we see on the left is him being guarded by U.S. Marshals, making sure nobody harms him. But then during one of the riots at the school, James Meredith was shot, which you see a picture of on the right. So people were so upset that an African American had been let into the school that there were a lot of riots, and unfortunately he was injured in one of the riots. Okay, but fortunately he would survive this incident. Okay, so there's obviously some opposition to the civil rights movement, and one of the big opposers of it was Governor Wallace. So Governor Wallace was an American politician, and he served as the 45th governor of Alabama for 4 terms. He was a member of the Democratic Party, and he was known for being a staunch segregationist. So he said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So he didn't like the idea of America where segregation wasn't a thing anymore. In June 1963, just 5 months after becoming governor, he had a stand in the schoolhouse door policy where he stood in the door of a Foster auditorium to protest integration at the University of Alabama, which we see on the right. We also have the March on Washington. So the March on Washington is pretty well known. On August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 demonstrators took part in the March on Washington for jobs and freedom in the nation's capital. So the march was successful in pressuring the JFK administration to initiate a strong federal civil rights bill in Congress. So the March on Washington was about civil rights, voting rights, and racial equality. And it was also about the need for jobs and for jobs that paid a decent wage. So the marchers wanted the federal minimum wage raised nearly 75% from $1.15 an hour to $2 an hour. Okay, so while there is discrimination happening among African Americans, there's also discrimination among Mexican Americans. So the Chicano movement emerged out of the broader Mexican American civil rights movement of the post-World War II era. So the word Chicano was initially considered a derogatory term for Mexican immigrants until activists they reclaimed the term in the 1960s. And they used it to fight for political and social change for Mexican Americans. The Chicano movement confronted discrimination in schools, politics, agriculture, and other formal and informal institutions. Okay, so a big civil rights activist for Mexican Americans was Cesar Chavez. So he was an American labor leader and civil rights activist. Along with Dolores Huerta, he co-founded the National Farm Workers Association, which later merged with the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee to become the United Farm Workers Labor Union. So he was really fighting for rights for blue-collar workers, specifically farmers and people who worked in agriculture. Okay, so during this time, we also see kind of an uptick in women's fight for equality. So the women's fight for equality the women's movement stalled during the 1930s and 1940s, but by the 1960s, it was back in full force. So celebrating the 50th anniversary of women's right to vote, which was sponsored by the National Organization for Women, the 1970 protests focused on employment, discrimination, political equality, abortion, free childcare, and equality in marriage. So all of these issues foreshadowed the backlash against feminist goals in the 1970s. So not only would feminism face opposition from other women who valued this traditional homemaker role, the feminist movement would also fracture internally as minority women challenged white feminist racism and lesbians vied for more prominence within feminist organizations. Okay, so here's pictures of women protesting for equal rights. Okay, so a very important book that came out this time during this period was The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. So Betty Friedan was an American feminist writer and activist. She was a leading figure in the women's movement in the United States, and her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, is often credited with sparking the second wave of American feminism in the 20th century. So, like I said, during the 1940s and 1950s, we kind of see a decline after World War I, during the Great Depression, of the women's rights movement, but people believe that this work kind of bolstered the women's movement and kind of pushed them to fight for rights again. Okay, so next we have Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. So Johnson's Great Society, which we'll watch a video about on the next slide, but just some basics of what it was. So it established the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this was important because it quickened the end of Jim Crow, and it secured African Americans equal access to restaurants, transportation, and other public facilities. And it enabled Blacks, women, and other minorities to break down barriers in the workplace. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was an important piece of legislation because it prohibited racial discrimination in voting. Okay, next we have Medicare and Medicaid. On July 30th, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Social Security Act amendments, and which is popularly known as the Medicare bill. So it established Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is a health insurance program for the elderly, where Medicaid is a health insurance program for the poor. Okay, and then lastly, we have community action. So community action was probably the most controversial feature of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society and his war on poverty, because it attempted to fight poverty on a local level through a massive infusion of federal funds. Okay, so now we're going to watch a quick video about Lyndon B. Johnson and his Great Society.
The Great Society. In 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson won the presidency with his plan for a Great Society, a plan that would lead to some of the most important legislation in U.S. history. We're going to take a look at the origins of the Great Society, what it entailed, and the legacy to this day. During the early 1960s, more than 20% of America's population lived below the poverty line, and civil rights demonstrations were making headlines. In 1964, during a presidential campaign event at Ohio University, LBJ gave the first of two famous Great Society speeches, promising Americans a society where, quote, no man who wants to work will fail to find it, where no citizen will be barred from any door because of his birthplace or his color or his church, where peace and security is common among neighbors and possible among nations. His plan included new government programs and social welfare legislation. Throughout LBJ's presidency, Congress enacted over 200 laws and programs, including education programs and policy to provide health care, improve public housing, expand transportation, and defend civil liberties. Many of these federal programs were incredibly successful and are still around today, like Medicare, Medicaid, the Food Stamp Act, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Upward Bound, a program that helps disadvantaged high school students get into college. Congress elevated the Department of Transportation to a cabinet-level office and funded new public transportation projects. Major funding for American public schools came through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Head Start created funding for early childhood education and preschools for poor working families.
Head Start cares about the whole family. It reaches beyond the child to parents who may not understand their children's needs.
The Voting Rights Act banned literacy tests and other discriminatory processes that kept African Americans from the polls. You can even thank LBJ for Sesame Street. Both PBS and National Public Radio were a part of the plan for a great society. Another major milestone of LBJ's plan was the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination based on skin color, race, national origin, religion, or gender. It established the Equal Opportunity Clause, which we still see on job applications today. But perhaps the most important part of the Great Society plan was the war on poverty. Between 1965 and 1968, spending to help the poor doubled from $1 billion to $2 billion. More than 40 programs were also put in place, and the effect was profound. The percentage of Americans below the poverty line dropped from 20% to 12% and has remained below 15% ever since. While LBJ's programs have certainly made an impact, a lot of them didn't last. Some blame the Vietnam War for diverting necessary funding. Others look to LBJ's political choices. He didn't run for a second term in office, so he didn't see many of his policies through. The presidents to follow would dismantle some programs and expand others. While politicians still wrestle over how to deal with poverty, healthcare, education, the impact of LBJ's efforts toward a great society are undeniable. Whatever you think about the policies, there's no doubt that a great society is one where no child will go unfed or unschooled, and where peace and security is the norm in all neighborhoods.
Okay, so this leads us into the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about the Vietnam War overall in the next slide. But for the Vietnam War, the United States feared the expansion of communist influence, and they pledged to confront any revolutions aligned against Western capitalism. So the major reason why we got involved was because of the domino theory. So this is the idea that if a country fell to communism, then neighboring states would soon follow. So if you kind of pushed over one country and it became communist, then like dominoes, they all would fall. So we have the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and this granted President Johnson the authority to deploy the American military to defend South Vietnam against North Vietnam. So during this time, we see a lot of activism and protests of just people protesting the U.S. government and involvement in the war. So culture and activism. So we have Joan Baez, and she was an American singer, songwriter, musician, and activist, and a lot of her songs included songs of protest and social justice. So a good example of kind of the mixture of activism and culture is seen in Woodstock. So Woodstock was known as the Woodstock Music and Art Fair, and it's commonly referred to just as Woodstock. This was a music festival held from August 15th to August 18th, 1969, and it was held on a dairy farm in Bethel, New York. Okay, so during this time, we have a lot of the youth kind of going against the man, and so kind of going against the government and kind of this era of rebellion. So now we see them or companies start to market to this counterculture. And the counterculture is really all about being different and kind of not being like your parents. So on the left is a advertisement for a bug, and it says, if you run out of gas, it's easy to push. And the whole reason why they made an ad like this, which is actually really weird, but they were saying, why would you take the easy route and take a reliable car like your parents have that you know will work every time, when you could perhaps take a risk and have some adventure? Like, maybe this car might not work, but that's part of the fun. Which actually worked, and it got a lot of younger people to buy this car. Which is just really interesting. Okay, so along this line of the counterculture, we have Mary Quant. She was the inventor of the miniskirt. So we see fashion changing a lot. So she was a British fashion designer and fashion icon, and she was an instrumental figure in the 1960s youth fashion movement. And she is one of the designers who took credit for the invention of the miniskirt. Okay, so this was another way for young girls to kind of rebel against their parents by wearing clothing that was a little bit shorter and not necessarily approved by their parents. Okay. So now we're going to look at beyond the civil rights movement, so the Black Power movement and Malcolm X. So Malcolm X was an African-American Muslim minister and human rights activist, and he was a prominent figure during the civil rights movement. He was a spokesman for the Nation of Islam until 1964, and he was a vocal advocate for Black empowerment and the promotion of Islam within the Black community. So when talking about the civil rights, he said, "I don't call it violence when it's self-defense. I call it intelligence." Okay, so here's a video that discusses a little bit about the Black Panthers and what they believed in.
Hi, I'm Yahuwah Williams. I'm a professor of history, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about the Black Panthers. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was founded in October of 1966 by two college students, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Newton and Seale created a 10-point program to outline their political views. Among other things, the Panthers called for an immediate end to police brutality, employment of African Americans, and a call for land, housing, and justice, actually citing the Declaration of Independence. The Black Panther Party was also part of the Black Power movement, which emphasized things such as Black pride, community control, and the importance of African Americans unifying for civil rights. In 1968, the Black Panther Party dropped self-defense from its title in order to emphasize its community programs. Among the most popular of the Panthers' social programs was their Free Breakfast for Children program. They also created free health clinics in 13 communities across the United States. Despite their social programs, the Panthers were involved in numerous encounters with police, some ending in violence and bloodshed. During the 1950s and 1960s, the FBI had a secret counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO, and the Panthers became one of the FBI's chief targets. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, famously even called the Panthers one of the greatest threats to the nation's internal security. A significant split between Panther leaders Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton led to internal friction, which threatened the existence of the party after 1968. The Black Panther Party was officially disbanded in 1982. Young people in large numbers came out and joined what became...
So another important figure in the civil rights movement was Tillman. So Tillman was an American welfare rights activist, and in 1963 she became ill and was encouraged to begin receiving welfare. So when she was receiving welfare, she saw how people on welfare were treated, and she organized those on welfare in the Housing Project. And in 1963, she founded ANC, Aid to Needy Children, Mothers Anonymous, which was one of the first grassroots welfare mothers organizations. So this organization later became part of the National Welfare Rights Organization, and she became the first chair of the National Welfare Rights Organization. So just like the video was saying about the Black Panther Party and how they started, working within their community, the same thing happened with Tillman. Okay, so in 1969, Americans hailed the moon landing as a profound victory in the space race against the Soviet Union. So at the beginning, I said that one of the issues with the 1960 election that they were focusing on was the space race and dealing with making sure that we did not fall behind technologically with the Soviet Union. So the landmark achievement of landing on the moon fulfilled the promise of JFK, who declared in 1961 that the United States would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. So Americans marveled at this achievement at the beginning of the 1960s, but it was only punctuated by years of turmoil. So as we saw, there's a lot of racial inequality that's still happening. We get involved in the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War disillusioned a generation. Riots rocked cities, protests hit campuses, and assassinations robbed the nation of many of its leaders. So that's what we are going to look at next week, or for the next lesson of the 1970s. We will preview a little bit about the end of the 1960s and then how the 1960s affected what happened in the 1970s.